recording this meeting since I forgot earlier, and go ahead and introduce you to today's speaker. Today, we are hearing about research from Dr. John Harris. A short intro about him before I turn over presenter control. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Services here at Pitt, and a researcher at the McGee Women's Research Institute. He went to Williams College, a medical school at the University of North Carolina, residency at the University of Kentucky, and a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Services Research Fellowship at the University of Michigan. He has been at the University of Pittsburgh since 2016. His research focuses on health system issues related to obesity and health system disparities. We are very excited to hear about his research and what he's been working on today. So with that, I am going to turn over controls to him. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Heather. Let me get us started. All right. So how does this look to people? Can people see my slide?
Yes, that looks perfect.
Wonderful. Well, I I think with a smaller group, it's nice for me to keep my screen on. I'll admit that giving talks with the screen and the camera and everything, it's always an interesting experience. I'm going to be looking off at my slides during this time, but please interrupt me at any time if you have questions. This doesn't, I try to cover a lot of space. It doesn't naturally lead to questions, perhaps, but I'll try to do a better job than I feel like this presentation starts with. So I will first disclose conflicts of interest. So I don't have any conflicts of interest other than I'm very enthusiastic about improving caregiving of all sorts. And I do have funding from HRQ. Some of this research I'm presenting was due during my K-12 funding. And I also, the exciting family caregiving studies I'm going to be doing in the future will also should be funded by the Department of Health. That's pending, but is close to being granted. So today's talk, I'm going to describe first the relative absence of any sort of family caregiving or informal caregiving research around caring for individuals with obesity. Certainly my interest is in the kind of more severe forms of obesity, so BMI is greater than 40, but I'll describe a lot of work across the spectrum. And then I'm going to transfer over to paid and formal caregiving and talk about the research that does exist, which of course has some analogs to what should exist in other settings, but is where we can kind of learn the most about this area. Describe the Department of Health project that I'll be getting going in home and community-based care for people with obesity. And so that'll be the talk. And so we'll kind of go through and see. It might be, I might have to speed up at times, but we'll go along. So first, I've met a few of you before, but I'd like to introduce myself again. So, as a researcher or professionally, I always say that my goal is to help solve complex operational problems in healthcare systems through federally funded research, organizational innovation, and personalized clinical care. As a researcher, since I've been at McGee Women's Research Institute and Pitt, my work tends to kind of merge disparities research and healthcare organizational research, focusing on the challenges that exist for obesity. And really what that comes down to are the manifold issues around caregiving, and whether that's caregiving by a paid nurse assistant or by a family caregiver, there are a lot of the same problems. So my general hypothesis in all this work is not groundbreaking, but I think it should last my career, but that patient obesity negatively affects appropriate safety, health, and quality of life for those utilizing long-term care services, for people with disabilities, for people that need extra services, and inadequate or inconsistent organizational structures and processes lead to increased safety risks in health care for people with obesity. So obesity clearly acts on the system, and then the system does not help that much to improve things. So we have kind of, to me, a cycle of problems. So you may say, well, so wait a minute, you're an OBGYN, you're talking about long-term care, most people at this point can't follow how this goes. So let me explain a little bit about my interest. So I have a long-standing interest in long-term care and caregiving. I was a nurse assistant at an adult daycare center before I went to medical school. I was a hospice volunteer, had a lot of experience with kind of older adult populations, and was always interested in that kind of physical caregiving. And I think that's ultimately why I ended up in OBGYN, because it has a nice physicality to it in terms of being able to help people. And as a healthcare system researcher, I have some training in that. I did RWJ fellowship there at Michigan. And my current funding is looking at nursing homes as a laboratory for how the healthcare system cares for people with obesity. I'll explain why nursing homes in a second. And the goal is to build an educational toolkit aimed mostly at formal caregiving and at the organizational leaders of those caregivers. And my clinical passion is the McGee Women's Center for Women with Disabilities. We care for a lot of women with physical and intellectual disabilities. And a lot of my patients do exist in the residential care or long-term care setting. And so I see a lot of patients from nursing homes. And I also, since my passion is sort of around severe obesity, I also specialize in providing, I hope, really high quality care for people that have a lot of difficulty due to their obesity receiving high quality care. So people with very extreme BMIs, we will also see in our clinic. So I'm going to start big picture and then zoom into caregiving in a second. But as we know, weight gain is common. People are usually gain weight during their lifetime, during their adult lifetime. Most of the weight gain is in middle age. And so that's when people are gaining, a pound or 2 pounds a year for some period of their adult lifehood. And because of that, a lot of adults do gain a significant amount of weight during their adult time. So very few people lose weight, most people gain weight. Now, already there's a high prevalence of obesity in the US. Some of this is because of this weight gain, and some of this because people start in the obese category and they keep moving up. And so the prevalence of obesity in the US, in the most recent NHANES data is 42% of US adults meet the definition of BMI of 30 or greater. Pretty amazing. And among severe obesity, that's 7% of men and 11% of women that meet a BMI of 40 or greater. So when we think about these caregiving issues, while I do think that they're problematic for anyone that may reach the criteria of a larger mass to move around and to be an issue, there's certainly a large enough population with a BMI of over 40 that this is an area of focus for me. And as we know, when we think about the combination of obesity and disability and aging, our aging population is only going to grow. So just to show you, this is how people report their body size changing over their middle age. And so I think it's fascinating that there's plenty of trajectories, and many of them involve rising at some level. Not surprising that if you look at the rate of obesity and severe obesity in the US among adults, that it's been rising. It's really been severe obesity, as I'm talking about today, it's essentially doubled in the last 20 years. And so this is becoming an issue. And so if we think about how slow healthcare changes, I would argue that the system essentially is the same in 2000 as it is in 2018, but yet you're talking about a significantly different population in terms of caregiving needs. And then, for my interest, I definitely focus, a lot of my work is on men and women, but I do think that it's an important women's health issue. We know that women are more likely to be severely obese. They're more likely to be caring for those that are severely obese, men and women. They're more likely to be both paid or unpaid caregivers. And so I think it's a women's health issue on multiple fronts. Now, most of the focus and the billions of dollars that are spent on obesity tend to be focused on preventing weight gain or helping people to lose weight. However, I always like to remind people that that research is actually surprisingly has not led to a lot of major breakthroughs. There's certainly important medications and surgeries that have come out of it, but essentially, we don't have a big expectation that weight will change. And so my argument is that we should be working to help people where they are, as well as helping people lose weight. So we know that obesity is associated with increased mortality and morbidity, decreased quality of life because of functional issues and comorbidities. People in society live at whatever body shape they are and size they have. So while we should manage people's body size towards a healthier status, we must manage medical and caregiving needs specific to people with their current body shape and size, with the goal of incrementally decreasing mortality and morbidity and increasing quality of life. And the greater difference between someone's body size and the normal, quote unquote, the greater difficulty in normal life and healthcare. And so that's why I focus on severe obesity. So just to give you a general overview of obesity disparity research and health systems, that healthcare delivery is certainly challenged, as we can all kind of hypothesize very easily, because of medical comorbidities, because of technical and equipment limitations, because of facility constraints, staffing requirements, differences in medication dosing, obesity stigma, which is a real issue in healthcare settings, and provider bias. So the places where previous studies have shown disparities in care include a decreased rate of breast cancer screening, decreased rates of certain types of vaccinations, increased rate of hospitalizations, different types of critical care usage, nursing home care, and end-of-life care. So what's the ideal population to study caregiving for people with obesity? So I have this little 4x4 table, and the way I read this is, as you go up, you have greater available resources. So some of our healthcare settings, by definition, have higher sets of resources than others, and the people that show up in those healthcare settings will have different levels of intensity of care. So to fill out this box, the places that have the least intensity of care needed, but the most resources available, would be least sensitive to the challenges of obesity. Ironically, this is where most of the research was done. It was done in outpatient settings and clinic visits and things like that. And that's where most of the research was done, in this top left corner, which, as I started to think about, I was like, we're not even going to see the effects of obesity in the ways that I was interested in, because for seeing someone once a year or several times a year at, say, a doctor's office or something like that. The places down in the bottom right corner would be the most sensitive to obesity. So to fill this out, outpatient care, top left corner, least sensitive to obesity. And then you could say inpatient care, people are more sick, but we have the most resources. So by definition, hospitals are going to have the most resources and intensity of care available for providing care. So if someone with severe obesity shows up in a hospital, it's challenging, but we can imagine that it would be more challenging in some of these other settings. So when I think about these bottom corners, home and community-based services is an area where there's less resources, and the intensity is still actually very intense, but the care intensity is different than, say, nursing home care. So this is how I kind of thought through this, and why I focus on nursing homes is just because clearly they are very, very sick patients. And while it is an inpatient and in a residential setting, the services available in nursing home, as we're all familiar, are actually fairly minimal. The staffing is minimal, the resources are minimal, the payments are minimal. It's a challenging environment. So that's why I think that focusing on caregiving, both in home and community-based services and in nursing homes, has been a very fruitful exercise for me. And so I certainly think that the informal and formal, and I'll admit that like the language here, and I'm not a caregiving expert anyway, but unpaid, paid, family, formal, informal. I'm basically just using this as sort of like paid healthcare providers versus family members, friends, everyone else that cares for someone that has additional needs. The experience of these informal and formal caregivers are both very important. I definitely agree. They share many of the same activities in what I'm talking about: issues with transfers, equipment, accessible rooms and buildings, risks for injuries to the caregiver, things like that. And they're different in many aspects. Certainly, as I've come to learn, the commitment to the person with obesity is just a completely different thing when it's someone's spouse or someone's mother than when compared when it's, you know, the nurse aides, when it's that person that was assigned to take care of that person for, you know, a few hours. The risk tolerance is going to be very different between informal and formal caregivers. The financial resources will clearly be different, training and regulations, all these things. Obvious, but kind of an interesting comparison. So we're going to do a lot of comparison. I think that sometimes I think I'm learning about both, but there are times when I think there's a lot of big differences. So formal caregiving has been much better studied in the literature. I wouldn't say that it's been amazingly studied, but it's out there. And there's a real absence of work in informal caregiving for people with obesity, even though I would argue this seems like one of the most common caregiving challenges out there. All right, so what's known about informal caregiving? I was kind of leading this way. I know that you're trying to improve family caregiving through the center. And so I wanted to start here, and it's certainly really important. But as you see, my slides won't continue for very long. So the only paper that is, this is a paper that I helped write a few years ago. And I was really hoping that I would find more stuff on this when I went back to review the literature for this talk. And unfortunately, there's nothing else besides our work when it comes to thinking about family caregivers and obesity. And what we did was we used the National Health and Aging Trends Study. This is back, I wrote this when I was in fellowship, so we used that up to 2015 at the time. We looked at older adults with a BMI over 18, so we basically excluded underweight, because underweight tends to throw off these analyses for a variety of things I can talk about. And we looked at whether people with obesity, a BMI over 30, whether they were more or less likely to report deficits in their ADLs, but not receiving caregiving. So essentially unmet needs around caregiving for people with obesity. We adjusted for, I hope, a range of things that were important to caregiving, including everything from cognitive status, which is really important, and then things that were important to caregiving, like people in the household, the severity of the disability, and things like that. So what we found in this study, so our hypothesis was that obesity leads to less assistance, but why? One would be that there would be barriers to assistance. There would be insufficient resources. People may not have a Hoyer lift. There might be stigma related to obesity. Maybe those caregivers would not enjoy as much caring for it, or a person that in need may not ask for help as much. And there's obvious physical difficulty in providing that resources. And then also, the association between obesity and less assistance would be complicated by some other things. We know that people with obesity tend to have different types of disabilities than people without obesity, and kind of older adults, classically less cognitive dysfunction. They tend to be younger. They tend to be healthier in some ways, less healthy in other ways. And because of the youth and some of the differences in cognitive status, they tend to be a little bit more independent. And so we just thought that maybe they would be easier to manage things alone. So first, to my surprise, that in general, people with obesity were actually more likely to report an ADL deficiency that were mobility related. So they were, as you can see, more likely to report any ADL deficiency, the white bar on the right side, and they were more likely to report, compared to normal or overweight categories, more likely to report issues with transferring in and out of bed, walking, dressing, walking outside. Things like that. As we shouldn't be surprised, issues like eating were unaffected, but there's a little difference in toileting and things like that. So these were unadjusted, but surprisingly, even in their unadjusted form, that the needs were higher in this population. I really thought that the confounding effects of age and cognitive status would have said that this would have been different. And when we looked at whether there was an association between obesity and unmet care needs, we controlled for a bunch of things in a stepwise fashion to kind of try to understand what was going on. So in our unadjusted model, in our unadjusted model, we found that obesity people were much less likely to receive, they were much less likely to receive assistance with essentially everything but dressing. So much less likely to receive assistance. And then when we started to adjust for things, what you'll see is that the point estimate returns to the null, or to one a little bit closer, but what's surprising is the point estimate kind of sticks until you add cognitive status. And by this point, we have a lot of different things in the model, and our confidence intervals were wide enough that we started to lose any effect of obesity and unmet needs. So what does this mean? I'll go to the next slide. There is more unmet caregiving need among people with obesity and overweight. And this unmet need is mediated through a variety of things, but there's no association that we could find with household resources or available caregivers. It seems to be based on other issues, and that cognitive status does explain some of the differences. So it may be that people that do have some cognitive impairment are simply at that point, like they've kind of reached the element where everyone is willing to be more helpful, even if there was a need beforehand. And so sometimes, we think about, once again, why are these people not getting the care they need? It's not immediately obvious to me. I was somewhat, I think that we would have continued to find an effect size if we had a slightly larger sample size. I know that for some people, 5,600 sounds like a good sample size, but using the methods that we used, using obesity as a categorical variable and putting a lot of things in the model, it's definitely going to increase our confidence intervals to where I think that some of our lack of effect was through that mode. So what else is known about caregiving? So once again, I did not like a systematic review. I did search pretty hard and look for anything that was in the literature since then or before then. And the only thing that I couldn't find anything, but I have been doing work with informal caregivers and family caregivers through my nursing home research. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. I've only recruited, this is one thing I guess we have you talk about. I've only recruited 3 caregivers, and it's very hard for me to recruit residents obviously during COVID, but even beforehand, just because we don't have an obvious way of identifying people, and people are often just not really excited to talk about this. So it can be a little bit challenging, but we have talked to some caregivers and I can show you what they said. So in our small sample size of semi-structured interviews, and what we're doing is asking informal caregivers how they cared for their loved ones before they went to a nursing home, what it was like to watch their care in the nursing home, what it was like to take them home after a nursing home, kind of get that kind of a wraparound experience of the nursing home. And they had a few different things. First, these informal caregivers obviously have tons more experience, and they were often frustrated with watching formal caregivers provide services that they thought that they did better and more efficiently than what they were watching in nursing homes. So here they are in a nursing home, obviously not an ideal setting that anyone wants to be in for their loved one. And they thought that the care was often seemed like it was inferior for a variety of reasons. And there's all these stories, which we could imagine happen for all nursing home residents, but where the family caregiver would provide some of this care just because the nurse aide wouldn't come in time or whatever else. And they're just like, I can do this on my own. The other thing, which is probably very obvious to experienced caregiver researchers, but was like a real epiphany for me, was that family caregivers essentially take on so much more risk, and they're okay with it, than could ever be tolerated in a formal caregiving setting. So they frequently talk about, we have a Hoyer at home, but it's only me that operates it. And, like in a healthcare setting, Hoyers have to be operated by 2, you have to have 2 people in a room to operate them, 2 nurse aides or whatever the formal caregiving setting, that wouldn't be allowed to just have one person in a room in a hospital or in a nursing home. But people use a Hoyer alone. They help with transfers, they help with turning, they help with skincare. They all do these things, these very difficult things. In these cases, I interviewed family caregivers of very large patients, and they do all these things alone, and they've done them for years often. And they do report injuries, so you can see that they say, to get his, this is his mobile, what's it called, kind of mobile cart, to get him in that, it would take in the setting of a hospital, 4 people did that for him, but I've been doing it by myself. And technically, you're not supposed to do that because you're supposed to have 2 people at least. Back issues are always a problem for her, the caregiver, because you do something like I'm trying to pulling up out of his chair with his shorts, and we just had to stop because I kept pulling my back out. So clearly obvious, but challenging issues. And we see this risk-taking behavior that is not surprising in informal caregivers. So I'm going to switch over and talk about the caregiving, what we know about caregiving needs in formal caregivers, but my goal when we get to the end of this is I really think that the family caregiver vantage point is fascinating. And I'm going to be able to recruit more informal caregivers in our new home and community-based services work that I'll talk about at the end. So I'm going super slow, so I'll go a little bit faster. But nursing home care, I think I've already made the point. It's clearly a very challenging issue. Nursing home care, there's a lot of research done. That's certainly why it was easy for me to find a mentor when I went to obesity in nursing homes when I moved to Pittsburgh. And it's been a great combination for me due to the just really excellent resources and research that's in nursing home care. So, for those of you that aren't familiar, nursing home care, they have complete administrative data for essentially everyone that's in a nursing home in the US, including height and weight. So that makes it a very versatile data set to look at how people with obesity are distributed among nursing homes and the quality of nursing homes. There's rich infrastructure about the quality of each of these nursing homes that people are in, about their staffing, things like that, about their function in the nursing homes. There's longitudinal measures of that, and there's linkages with healthcare data like Medicaid and Medicare. So it's a really amazing place to study things. There has been work talking about the caregiver challenges within nursing homes. I don't know of anything in the media, but these two things came out right next to each other, right as I was actually trying to get a job. So I was like, everyone, this is a big deal. I was really glad for the timing of this when I was doing job talks. And just talking about the challenge of obesity, both on patients and getting the right care, as well as on nursing homes. So just in case you think about nursing homes as places where they're mostly very old adults with cachexia and a lot of cognitive conditions, obesity has increased dramatically in nursing homes, just like it has in the general population. So 30% of nursing home patients are now with a BMI of 30 and over, and severe obesity is more common in nursing homes than it is in the general population. And so just of note, they're much younger. People with severe obesity, say BMI greater than 50, these are residents that are in their 50s and 60s. So not an older group, but actually these very young, unfortunately, often dual eligible Medicaid payers. So they have the least resources, they have a lot of need, and they're more likely to be in vulnerable populations, including people of Black race. So not surprisingly, people with an increased BMI. So in other words, who are we caring for? These are people that have less cognitive impairment. They have less behavioral issues. They have a less history of stroke and cancer, which are more like age related. They're less likely to have hip fractures in nursing home settings. They're more likely to have diabetes, coronary artery disease, hypertension. They're more likely to have multi-drug resistant bacteria and wound infections. So I think wounds are going to be a really central area of home care that family caregivers are going to provide for this population. And in nursing homes, there's no association between BMI and deficits of activities of daily living. So the people with an increased BMI need about the same amount of assistance, technically. What do we know in general about differences in nursing home processes? So residents with severe obesity are more likely to be denied admission. So this goes back to family caregiving problems. The home health care, people have problems getting home health care. They have problems getting nursing home care. So you the system is pretty rough, and people often end up in either nursing home care for longer than they want, or even in the hospital for longer than they want because they can't get out. 81% of nursing home administrators report that equipment is a big barrier to admission for very obese residents. They report finances that are a problem. These are certainly things that will carry over into other caregiving settings as well. There's a little bit of research about the technicalities of, bathing takes much longer. There's many more people need a two-person assistance, not surprisingly, and there's more difficult finding home health care services when leaving a nursing home. So what are some differences in outcomes? So this is a difficult issue with the confounding, because if I compare to older, thinner residents, it's a strange comparison, but people with increasing BMI are more likely to develop pressure ulcers during their long-term stays. They're more likely to have indwelling catheters for obvious reasons, though not evidence-based. They're more likely to have longer stays in nursing homes. They're more likely to need to be readmitted when they have the diagnosis of a hip fracture. And there's some qualifications around hospital admissions between different researchers, but it's not it's not a positive, it's not a good thing to be have obesity and to try to stay at the hospital. So I did a variety of projects when I moved here to Pittsburgh, basically trying to understand this relationship better using a variety of things. And I'm going to skip through this pretty fast. So I used the minimum data set, which is the big nursing home data set, to understand caregiving and staffing needs. How do you do this? Nursing homes obviously vary in the population throughout the year. So you pick a day and time and basically say, with a snapshot, what does nursing home care look like? For technical reasons, use April. First Thursday in April is what researchers use. And so back in 2013, this was 1.7 million residents in nursing homes at the time. So just to understand that population, which I've talked about already, but is that people with severe obesity are this is an average of 142 kilograms in this highest category. Their majority, this is nursing homes, so not surprisingly, they're majority female. There's a higher population of Black women. There's actually no association with length of stay, so people with obesity are distributed as long and short stay residents pretty equally. And they're more likely to need two-person assistance with most services except for eating. Once again, that seems very, very appropriate. But one of my questions was, where does this effect happen? And so when you graph it, as this is BMI on the x-axis and the probability of needing two-person assistance for any ADL on the y-axis, that for BMIs 30 and even 35 and over, it's still about the same amount of people that need assistance. But it really changes when you get to a BMI of, I'd argue it's starting to change at 35, 40, 50. This is where there's a real difference. So I often say that the work should focus on BMI of 35 or greater. I think that kind of makes sense from a pure physics standpoint, but it also does from how assistance is generally described in nursing home care. Won't go into this too much, but essentially, as you would not be surprised, nursing homes and home health and other funding sources essentially ignore body size when thinking about the resources that people need and the payment that various services will cost. So in this case, and it's a little different now, but this is the old nursing home payment system, but they ask about how much assistance people need. So you would get credit for needing a two-person assist. But what's ironic is that a full lift 85-year-old woman who has no body strength, who's also a full lift, is also technically a two-person assist. You can't even, so you have two-person assists. One weighs 100 pounds, one weighs 400 pounds. They get paid the same. It's very interesting when you think about the payment problems. I did a survey of directors of nursing in nursing homes in Pennsylvania as a part of my K, and the basic story is that they all agree that there were a bunch of problems for residents with obesity. In terms of people that strongly agreed on these different things, they said staff injuries. They strongly agreed that BMI associated with staff injuries is associated with pressure ulcers. I'm always kind of interested in the social aspect. A lot of people report that they don't think that severe obesity is related to more social isolation. You can think about some reasons why that might be true, and some people that's sometimes out there in the general literature, but I haven't been able to find it in nursing homes. And these are younger residents, so they actually might be the most social, ironically, of a nursing home resident. So maybe that's another factor in this. But they reported that they need extra staff needs, that they sometimes decline admission due to weight. Then they talk about, what's the weight that really affects our care? Is that there's not like a standard belief among these administrators yet, like what was the weight that was most important. So some people said, well, relatively low weight, 250 causes a problem. Other people said, well, once someone gets to 400, our Hoyer lifts, it's not the capacity, that's the thing. So there's kind of a lot of variation in how people view the problems with obesity. This was one of these slides that I asked. It was a silly, or sometimes the surveys, you kind of like, I'm not sure where this goes, but this was very helpful for writing grants. So I just basically said, do they think that obesity is a problem? Absolutely. And then when I asked, is there any training? 80% of the time they said there is no training around obesity. And they said, are there any special units? There's no special units. Is there any specific policies? There's no specific policies. Do you think it's going to be a problem in the future? Absolutely. So you've got a big problem, no sort of like way to mediate this problem, and a big problem in the future. And so obviously I made that a big pitch point for my for grants, that right? So, what do we know? It's clearly very challenging in nursing homes for a variety of reasons, and there's just a bunch of structural issues that are affected by these same patients. Staff interviews, and then I interviewed residents for this. They just said, I feel like the CNAs are overworked, and that they just feel overwhelmed. Residents said that they thought it was crazy to watch people try to lift them. They just said it'd be crazy to be trying to lift guys like us. They're going to ruin their backs. So it's an interesting two-way street how people see that caregiving as challenges, and then the recipients of caregiving see this as overwhelming for their caregivers as well. So I'm going to just move through this pretty quickly, but I received an R01 to look at nursing homes in further detail. And so we've done some qualitative work. We're doing a survey during COVID. You can kind of imagine how well that's going. And we are making a toolkit. So this was the team that we're working with. So Nick Castle, some of you may have been familiar with. He was in graduate school of public health for many years, and he's now the department chair at West Virginia, still lives in the area. I have a nursing home administrator and nursing home administrator professor, David Wolf, on the team. Allison Trinkoff is a nursing PhD who studied nursing environment and safety your life. Steve Handler, some of you may be familiar with, a geriatrician in Pittsburgh and the VA. And then John Enberg is at RAND. He's our statistician extraordinaire. And so we're doing a variety of things. We've done a bunch of interviews, mostly with paid staff. And we've done interviews with medical directors. There are the themes that we've already pulled from our medical director interviews are that obesity is obviously a marker of multimorbidity from a medical perspective. It's a marker of nursing care complexity. They recognize that. And there's a real interest in improving resident health, but there's a variety of reasons why it's very hard to help people become healthier, lose weight in a nursing home setting. And they see that as being a challenge. So doing a large organizational survey, I'm not going to really tell you too much about this, but studying a bunch of issues. This is from an administrator perspective. So they're going to tell us about how they help manage the caregiving issues among formal caregivers, but it's not of caregivers per se. It's going to be of the nursing home administrator. So this is our survey. We're making a toolkit. Toolkit's an educational device that's been fairly common in healthcare systems research, and we've got a website which we're getting started, and we're going to model it after a toolkit that's also in nursing home care around discharges and going back to the hospital. And so we plan to make things like a decision tree to help people in nursing homes decide how they're going to best care for people with obesity. Love to be able to make these sort of educational videos and kind of guides to making decisions. So that's our plan. This is an example of a toolkit where we basically help them think through, all right, if you need extra staff, here are some resources about flexing staff hours, about thinking about how to use their time efficiently, about thinking about cohorting patients so that you can use the resources efficiently and not using too much time. And then like on the bottom question, do you receive adequate revenue? If they don't know, they can receive some extra payment for severe obesity, and thinking about how to make sure that their payment is optimized. And our goal is to get people admitted with the services that they need. COVID pandemic's been a real problem for nursing home research, but life goes on. And then the last thing I wanted to share about was some of the work that I did in end-of-life care. This is actually older, but it's going to apply to the last part of my work. So I studied whether obesity affects end-of-life healthcare. So quality metrics at the end of life include hospice enrollment, hospice length of stay, in-home death, chemotherapy use. Many of you are familiar with these. There was no research that's really evidence-based on obesity and end of life. And so I just hypothesized that obesity meant that there was different caregiving needs, different trajectory of illness, different kind of visual bias about who's sick and who's not. and challenges with hospice enrollment, similar problems related to home health or nursing homes. And so there would be a different probability of hospice enrollment and different timing of enrollment in hospice. And what we showed back in 2016, I think, was that obesity was associated with decreased end-of-life healthcare and increased Medicare expenditures in the last 6 months of life. So we used the health and retirement study and Medicare claims and looked at people over a 14-year span of time. And what we showed in the final analysis was, first, what does obesity look like at the end of life? This is interesting to me, but like that people with obesity are much younger than people without obesity, that they tend to have a lot more, they tend to be more disadvantaged, they have lower income levels, less support, things like that. I'll just move through this. Their chance of getting into hospice was much lower. So when you controlled for a bunch of issues that you think would associate with it. So we controlled for their level of disability, we controlled for their income level, we controlled for a bunch of things, that the chance of being enrolled in hospice, all things being the same, including like medical conditions and things like that, 38% for someone with a BMI of 20, it's only 23% for someone with a BMI of 40. So that's a big drop. And so 15% or 15 percentage point drop and chance of being in hospice, which is a good ideal thing. So then, I'm jumping through this. Total hospice days was shorter as people's BMI was higher, so they get less of those days if they get into hospice. Their chance of in-home death is slightly less common. I didn't present this, but their chance of dying in the ICU is higher if they're in the hospital. Not surprisingly things. And then total healthcare expenditures at the end of life was higher. You lose the effect of BMI 40, and that's somewhat just due to the sample size, but it is more expensive than for someone that is in the BMI of 20 group. So, finally, I just want to talk about what I'm doing in home and community-based services. So I study nursing homes. About 1.6, 1.7 million people live in nursing homes in the US right now. That number is always getting lower. As you are probably familiar with home and community-based services, about 7 million people receive those services, and that number is always getting bigger. And in some of the recent administration proposals, they're going to increase home and community-based services by $400 billion over 10 years. So these are big area of focus. So basically, I wanted to study different types of unmet needs, inadequate services, and adverse outcomes for people in home and community-based services, and studying this through NHATs as well as qualitative interviews. And I'm going to interview a substantial amount of informal caregivers as a part of this. So we're going to do it, hopefully, a total of 240 interviews. We do these over the phone, so they're pretty COVID okay as long as we can reach them and enroll them. It's pretty easy to do. And then I'm going to use NHATs and NSOC to study paid and unpaid caregiving among older adults with and without obesity. This is being funded by the PA Department of Health through the Tobacco Settlement Research Grants, which have been available for the last 20 years or so. So that's it. I'm glad I stopped here. I am not a caregiving research expert. And so I guess I was just kind of wondering, after you guys kind of listen to this, what do you think? Like, what are the questions that I should be asking caregivers? Certainly, I think asking in a more defined way about burden. I mean, they all tell me about burden. I know that there's metrics for this that maybe I should consider instead of just getting a qualitative measurement. Understanding, interactions between family caregivers, paid caregivers, understanding the need and for why people choose residential care when they need to. I think that process could look a little differently. And then this is my second question for you is, when you think about this, can you think of comparable areas of caregiving research that it may be helpful for me to learn from? So for instance, as I was brainstorming, I imagine there's some research about caregiving differences based on cognitive function and how that differs. And obviously, caregiving for someone with dementia looks different than someone without dementia. In my mind, those are sometimes some interesting comparisons to make, because then I can basically look at a set of literature and be like, oh, how did they study that difference? And then I can kind of port that problem over and be like, I'm going to study obesity in that way. So it's just like ways that I brainstorm on things. But if anyone has any comments or questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Dr. Harris, I'll start. My name's Grace Campbell, and I'm with the Family Center on Support. And thank you so much for that really thought-provoking talk. I had never sort of thought about these problems in this way, and I appreciate your perspective. I think this may kind of address some of your questions about other areas of research. But I think it comes not so much from a caregiving perspective, but from a safe patient handling and movement perspective. There's a rich and varied literature on safe patient handling and movement, including toolkits that have been published and are well in use by the VA in particular. And there's been some really foundational research done there. And it occurs to me, I worked on some of these task forces around this issue probably 15 or 20 years ago. And it occurs to me as you were talking about nursing homes and the problems that formal caregivers have with not having enough staff to provide care for these residents, that those are the same kinds of things that we were hearing 20 years ago. And I'm wondering, not necessarily so much about, so I'm wondering a couple things. Is there an opportunity to port some of that research in? And then for me, the bigger question is, what are the policy implications here? Because for me, this centers around reimbursement for both staff as well as equipment. There is so much equipment out there for safe patient handling and movement that goes beyond a Hoyer lift, and that has been well recognized to decrease staff injury, resident injury, caregiver injury. And so I'm just kind of wondering if there's been any sort of cross-pollination between your work and safe patient handling and movement so far, and what options you see for that as well as for policy. And I'm going to stop talking now.
No, I've done enough talking. I can tell you that I have reviewed a lot of that safe patient handling work. I find the toolkits kind of interesting in that they come up with a kind of an arbitrary thing. They're like, and when patient weighs more than 200 pounds, consider this. And part of me thinks that like these are they should be a little bit that there's some room to kind of reconsider this as the demographics change, just because what used to be seen as kind of like if you have to do, this person definitely needs to be a no lift type situation, but I just don't think that there may be that clear about what you do about people that, weigh much more, which to me still seems like it's going to be a slightly different process there. There's certainly, that's the thing, like if you talk to an administrator, they'll say, well, the one policy that we definitely have that's related to obesity is safe patient handling. So it's certainly a central characteristic that every administrator and staff knows, but safe patient handling, there's the right thing to do, and then there's like the efficient thing to do. And clearly, Hoyer lifts take a lot more time. Still nursing homes, most of them are going to be using Hoyer lifts. They take a lot more space. In terms of policy implications, the easy place in nursing home care is to think about measuring, outcomes related to obesity, and trying to understand that better. Certainly, just like they track infections and things like that. I think that that tracking some outcomes related to obesity, including the development of pressure ulcers in that population, is kind of a specific one that might be hiding. If you take a whole nursing home and let's say over a couple of years, they have a certain amount of pressure ulcers, and that might be kind of a good baseline rate. But what we've found sometimes is that there are nursing homes that are clearly having a lot more of these among the obese population. And it's almost like there's some places that just struggle to care with this particular population. So there's that. In terms of the policy implications for payment, the only thing that's very encouraging to me is that whenever you integrate long-term care with hospitalizations, there's a lot more interest in trying to make both of them work better. So UPMC is definitely a win for people with severe obesity when they come to the hospital, because the hospital knows that they need to get them out of the hospital, and UPMC's senior communities understands that their mission is to help those discharges happen. So they talk about how these patients will go on the the computerized referral system, and they'll go out and no one will accept them, and they just turn around and they say, listen, like, this person wasn't accepted anywhere, will you take them? And they take them, and they're a high quality facility, and so and they have it's a great nonprofit organization, so they take the best cares. But the worst case scenario is that a nursing home's, they've got some open beds, they need to fill the bed, and they take somebody when they can't actually provide the services, which also happens as well. So I'm not sure if that goes anywhere, but patient handling is definitely the most developed area around obesity, though I think that it could be better. Just in the way the stuff is written, it just tends to be like, there's like normal weight and overweight. And I feel like there's got to be a little bit more gradation, but that's just obviously my angle.
Thank you.
I think something that Grace mentioned about equipment available would be interesting to pose to the informal caregivers, because there's, your little testimonials showed that they're making it work in non-ideal circumstances, but are they made aware of the assistive equipment that's out there, and are they able to access it both logistically and financially? Because that might be kind of that unmet need of the bridge to keep them out of nursing care and to make it easier for family caregivers to do what they're already doing. I know I have family and paid caregivers, and I often don't know about all the equipment that's out there. You find ways to make it work, and so you keep doing that because it's what you know. But there's probably a lot of missing assistive equipment that people just don't know exists and don't know how to find out about it either.
Absolutely. And we can imagine the people that I've often interviewed, they do have Hoers in their home. They do, a lot, they spent, seems like tens of thousands of dollars of their own resources to try to keep their loved ones with them. But there might be other situations where if people are on that edge, that if we could get a Hoyer out to somebody, it would give them an extra period of time at home, and that's really worth it. Once again, the irony is, of course, that the system doesn't care that you're avoiding the nursing home. They just care about decreasing the cost, whatever, in home, in home health or something. It's a sticky wicket. There
are also, just to sort of, and I'm not going to belabor the point, but to sort of piggyback on Heather's comment, from having worked in rehab my entire career, there are many other assistive devices besides Hoyer lifts that can be used to allow patients to participate in their own transfers with a single caregiver and that sort of thing. And I think that Heather has hit upon a sort of a like an aha thing, which is that there's such a breakdown in resource knowledge and resource education and provision by providers, formal providers to family caregivers, that, whether or not there are financial resources available, I mean, people find ways to have fundraisers and stuff, but the information breakdown is there that people aren't given information about what's available for them. So yes, thank you again. That was a really fascinating talk.
I would like to hop in.
Thanks so much. Yes, please.
Go ahead.
You go, Chair.
Okay. I just wanted to hop and say thank you. This was really interesting, and I hadn't thought about a lot of these issues in that way. I was really interested in your research where you interviewed the informal caregivers about their experience before, during, and after admission of the care recipient to the hospital or a nursing home. And it just made me think that, like, oftentimes when caregivers go into these, informal caregivers go into these situations, they feel, at best invisible and at worst adversarial with the staff that work within the facilities. And I'm sure there are cases where, they're able to work together for the good of the patient. But I know from my personal experience working in rehab and just reading some of the literature that oftentimes these caregivers feel like they're not being listened to. when they go into a formal setting. So I guess I was just curious, you mentioned this toolkit, and I wondered if there was anything in there, like ways to advance communication between these two parties, or like, how can they find a way to come together? Because these, you know, informal caregivers, though they may not have all of the equipment and resources that the facilities have, they are most of the time, a lot of the time, the experts in the care.
You know,
And,
I think that's,
yeah.
and there's clearly these times when the caregiver it's a chronic issue. They've been doing it for a long time,
Right.
and you know they're hospitalized for, you know, the person's hospitalized for a heart attack or something else. They end up in a nursing home, and the challenges that the nursing home is struggling with are the exact ones that have been managed at home. And you're right, it would be a really interesting place to have some sort of communication device where it's like, you know, our main challenge is with providing these physical services. Did you provide these services at home? Oh, you did?
Mm-hmm.
Tell us how. And you could imagine it. Now, some of this stuff, I would argue that the nursing home or rehab or whatever else would not be able to do exactly what they did because it's literally too dangerous, you know, and logistically. But but you're right. There's tons of stuff to learn.
Thank you.
John, I want to thank you so much for presenting to our group. And I have so many more questions, but I want to be mindful of the time and recognize probably you and others need to get off. But just one thing for sort of promoting future, we have Hansel Kim, one of our postdocs, will be presenting May 20th.
Oh, 21st. Yeah. May 21st.
May 21st.
Yeah, first.
On some of her research. Yes, good, 21st, with some of her research on sandwich generation caregivers. So excited about that. I think it's a really important emerging topic. John, I'd love to talk further about a couple ideas that sprung to my mind while you were talking. I imagine Anne-Marie also, Anne-Marie Roslin, here probably has some thoughts about the maybe looking into the complexity of care literature in chronic disease management that she's working on that probably has a lot of overlap with the work that you're doing and might, you know, spawn some interesting ideas to think about. And then the other one that I would think about is we're doing some work. Actually, there are two areas. I wonder, do you know how much obesity as a care recipient factor is taken into account in some of the big national data sets? And that might be something that to talk. What's that?
Like whether they're undersampled or something, or I'm sorry, like what do you mean?
Well, just whether they're in there, like in NHAT and thoughts, things like that, whether they're capturing, you know, the weight of care recipients as a factor in you know the various definitions, categories of care recipients.
That's a good question. I mean, they do. I mean, they measure height and weight, but then they just say, does the person need assistance with? You know, that's to me one of these challenges. Is like an ADL is an ADL, but that's an ADL, and the caregiving that ADL requires is actually not always. It will be mediated by mass and by cognitive. I mean, by their compliance with directions and by, you know, we could brainstorm for a while. And so that's why sometimes I find it frustrating where you're like, okay, I know they can't transfer and they need help with transferring, but it's just a different game between someone that weighs 100 and 400 or even 100 and 250. I mean, I tend to, sometimes the stuff is most illustrative with kind of these extreme obesity things. But I think that I hope that my research doesn't lose the fact that this is a continuum, that caregivers might be, you know, a loved one just being like, I love my spouse, but he's always been 6'4" and 230, and now it's a problem. Like, you know, even if the BMI is only like 35 or 33 or something like that, it's just there's a continuum to cover there. So it covers a little bit of it, and I'm thankful for those national surveys because they're my best source of information because there's really no reason I don't use administrative data otherwise, if that makes sense.
So the other thing that I was thinking about is we've been doing some work that, you know, comes out of mainly the aging literature, but around risks caregiver and care recipient risk factors for poor outcomes, right? And it's things like, certainly does your loved one has they been diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's, but then things like the physical health of the caregiver, the emotional health of the caregiver, the social support around that person, the intensity of care in terms of how many hours per month or hours per week that they provide, right? And it would be really interesting to see how those risk factors that we found, that we see in the caregiving literature, how that translates, in the aging population translates over to those in obesity caregiving, right? Do they hold up? Do they shine any more of a light on this issue?
That's I would love to use the National Survey of Caregivers and NHATs better. I'll admit that in the National Survey of Caregivers is a little bit complex in terms of how it works. And so I've been to like the talks that, the NIA and stuff gives at these national meetings and stuff. And I'm still always walk away from it just a little bit like scratching my head. But now that, this Department of Health funding will be, I'm definitely going to try to look there and try to expand that kind of thought process.
Well, I think, again, part of our center's funding, the first research project, which is Scott's, is really to map out all of these data sets and to understand what's in there from a caregiving, care recipient perspective, and to be able to sort of facilitate their use. So I recommend reaching out.
I would be happy to be a recipient of that knowledge.
Okay, great. And I saw that Anne Marie posted a note that she'd be happy to talk with you, about her work in caregiving.
Yeah, Anne Marie, we need to talk. We have some, because we have the Michigan connection. We've talked before. I need to talk with her again, because obviously you're right. She has a lot of crossover with complex medical conditions and all their caregiving needs.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for listening. It's always just a pleasure to get some feedback.
Thank you for being here. We will post video. I know this is end of semester and it's a busy time, and I think we'll definitely get more people coming in to listen and hopefully reaching out to you too. But we really look forward to future interactions with you, and please let us know what we can do to support your outstanding efforts in this really understudied area.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you're here, and I'm excited. I actually, I'll let you guys go, but I am applying to be a part of a NIDLR project grant around women and pregnancy and disabilities, and so I'm kind of getting NIDLR excited about things. Like,
oh, that's great. Well, again, if there's anything we can do to help with that, I think these grants are often big team efforts, and we have a lot of templates of what we did, which we got from other NIDLR recipients at Pitt. So.
Yeah, thankfully I'm just a co-I. I know I had to do my little segment, but the length of the whole thing was, I was like 75. I was just like, thank God I'm not the PI. That was my first thought. But anyway, you guys have a great day, and thank you for your time and your thoughts and listening. Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Bye.